Thank you, Manfred, for those very kind words. Thank you to the JCPA, who have together supported the NGO Monitor project from the beginning and really made it possible for us to develop the kind of research and publications and increasing impact. And thanks to my colleagues at NGO Monitor, this is clearly not a one-man show. And there's a great deal more work to be done. In the 15 minutes I have allotted, this will be one of the quickest 15-minute presentations that I've done. That'll go through a lot of material quickly. Some of it will be familiar to you. Some of it, I hope, particularly to European diplomats, will be new and disturbing. And there will certainly be plenty of opportunities in the next few years to develop a lot of these themes further. I am grateful that I am able to present this at the beginning of the conference, because I think the role of groups that proclaim themselves to promote human rights, to promote humanitarian assistance, to be charities, groups like War on Want and Christian Aid and Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, if I went to the list, I'd use up all my 15 minutes and more. These groups are very much at the forefront of the delegitimization of Israel. And the Durban strategy, the process that we saw not began, but reached a very important high point in the terms of articulating the use of this kind of terminology, of this rhetoric, of morally based claims to delegitimize Israel on each of these fronts, took place in the Durban Conference of September of 2001. The term Zionism and racism was brought back to life in full force. And at that conference, where we had 1,500 non-governmental organizations, including all of the superpowers, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, FIDH from Paris, all of these groups were very active. Adala, many of the groups that are financed and work out of Israel, of course, across with the Palestinian Authority, articulated this agenda, put the terms apartheid, racism as descriptions of Israel, the terms ethnic cleansing, acts of genocide, the accusations against Israel. This was not a one-time event that we can forget about in the Durban Conference of 2001, but it was the articulation and the foundation of the campaigns that we see every day. We saw 2 weeks ago a report by 5 major British charities, including Amnesty and Christian Aid, that declared Israel to be committing collective punishment in Gaza. Terms not only was an abuse of international law, but many of the facts were simply wrong. This was not an isolated event. This happens over and over again. It is largely accepted. It gets printed by hundreds of newspapers. It gets into all the mass media, and almost nobody stops and checks and asks, is this accurate? Are there double standards here? And we see this is becoming very much rooted in the process, the war against Israel through delegitimization. The Lebanon War is one particular episode. There are many of them, but I think the illustration of the way in which these organizations work became very, very clear during the Lebanon War. We saw it in Jenin. We saw it in Operation Defensive Shield. As I said, we're seeing it now in Gaza. We are at the beginning of another round, apparently, a wave of NGO attacks on Israel through the issue of housing demolitions. And Amnesty is circulating now letters and articles that make patently false claims. We didn't have time to put this on top of the in the PowerPoint, but you see waves in which you have dozens of these organizations all using the same type of language. And the Lebanon War, as I said, is one illustration of many. In a 6-week period in the Lebanon War, we had over 100 statements by NGOs, almost one a day for Human Rights Watch, except on weekends. Amnesty International started a little bit late, but quickly reached the same level. The language is almost always the same. 90% of these were directed against Israel. Only a very few criticized Hezbollah, and very often in very softer terms, as we'll see in a minute. The language that we see, the language that we continue to see in the condemnations, disproportionate force, war crimes, indiscriminate bombing, collective punishment, violation of international law. Now, in almost all of these cases, there are no definitions for these terms. They are used inconsistently. Israel is singled out. These are all double standards. But they are picked up by the United Nations. They are picked up by the media. They become headlines. We hear them from diplomats. They are repeated, they become part of the background information. Nobody questions them. And look how the propaganda war is run by an organization called Human Rights Watch, which has a budget of about $50 million a year. I know that Foreign Minister Livni's not here. I won't ask her what the budget for the Foreign Ministry for countering this is, but it is certainly less than 10%. These are put out in glossy brochures. They are handed out in press conferences. They are given all sorts of amplification. And what is the title of the main report? I said Human Rights Watch put out a statement almost every day. They put out one 45-page report in the middle of the war, the beginning of August, and the title was Fatal Strikes, Israel's Indiscriminate Attacks Against Civilians in Lebanon. Almost every word there is part of the war of delegitimizing Israel. There is no criticism of Hezbollah. This was clearly a war that Israel began, that Israel is using every possible illegitimate means to wage. That's the impression that one gets. The front cover, I don't know if it's staged or not, but this is supposed to represent, and may be a picture of the coffins that Hezbollah put out in Kana, one of the major events of the war, which forced Israel for 48 hours to suspend air operations from claims which were very, very unclear. Initially, Human Rights Watch sent out headlines that there were dozens of deaths. A few days later, they cut the number down to 28. Nobody knows, in fact, how many people were killed, but the propaganda value was very clear. And I would argue that, in fact, this type of activity is more powerful than the role of the military because it can stop the military. And that's what we saw in this case. It was published in Arabic, it was published in French, it was published in Hebrew. It was clearly had major, major impact. And as I believe it was Bernard Kalbs at Harvard University who published a study. This was the critical media event of the war. It was the one that most people remember, and the journalists in almost no cases went back and revisited afterwards to note how they reported false information when this was released. This is Amnesty International's version, not a major report, but the language is almost the same. Again, the deliberate destruction, Israeli attacks on civilian infrastructure, and then a specific reference to the 48 hours. I guess we had a problem with his Hebrew-English translation there, but we'll fix that in the next round. This is a Amnesty. I'm just going to go through a number of examples and show how this NGO war gets waged until Manfred cuts me off. This is 40 years after the 1967 war. Amnesty, another major report, similar type of process, glossy report, lots of illustrations. Look at the front cover, very clearly staged to show you who are the suffering, how are they suffering. Look at the apartheid wall in the background there. This was widely distributed. The language that was used, the wall of death. You have Holocaust language, just as you have it in terms like collective punishment and war crimes. It elicits the images of the Holocaust and who are the new Nazis. These are the Israelis doing these terrible things to the Palestinians. You will note this was 40 years, not after the 67 war, not after the attempt, as Nasser put it, to push the Jews into the sea. None of that is there in the background. This is 40 years of occupation. The historical framework is totally erased when these processes take place, and what you're left with is snap pictures which are designed to increase the delegitimization. We see this in the agendas of these human rights organizations. In 2004, 2006, the attacks on Israel took up 1/3 of the entire human rights activity, Human Rights Watch activity on the Middle East. Far more than the case of Libya, Saudi Arabia, Syria. Israel is by far the largest violator of human rights. If you look at the resources that an organization like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, in fact, the distortion is even greater. We don't have time to show the slides now. But the agendas that are set, and these are often set well in advance, the number of people, the number of research reports, and we'll get into the research and the quality of it in a minute, these agendas very much color the outcome. Israel, by all counts, must be seen as the worst violator. Otherwise, you wouldn't see this type of investment in the attacks that are made. Many of the reports simply are false in terms of facts. We have many of the number of reports, the number of press statements and other activities are far too many to go through in detail on each one. But if you pick many of them, you see the same process of using eyewitness testimony to make claims. And when you try to identify who are these people, what are their biases? In most cases, Amnesty International has one full-time researcher. Her name is Donatella Rivera. She does not speak Hebrew. I'm not sure she speaks any Arabic. She is responsible for running Amnesty's research. These are the kinds of reports that they put out. And how do they do it? They find eyewitnesses Usually, if it's in southern Lebanon, people who are associated with Hezbollah won't have to assume. If it's in Gaza, who is going to give amnesty testimony about the terrible things Israel's doing? Who are likely to be these eyewitnesses? And we see this happen over and over and over again. And when you try to confirm it, as Alan Dershowitz did, you come up with the conclusion that these are anecdotes, these are carefully chosen in order to make the case, rather than trying to prevent a factual set of images. Human Rights Watch also in many cases uses eyewitnesses. It uses claims from local NGOs, each of which have their own agendas and biases. They often will take the material from B'Tselem on Palestinian casualty counts, which will tell you that Israel is responsible for killing a large number of Palestinian civilians. How does B'Tselem know this? Largely because they'll either get it from Palestinian officials or they will get it from Palestinian eyewitnesses. Can this information be checked? No. It gets repeated, it gets picked up by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, it gets buttressed by eyewitnesses, it gets quoted in every report by Reuters, the number of Palestinian casualties, or the number of Israeli-Palestinian casualties, and the message is Israel is, again, indiscriminate killing. They report indiscriminate fire. They look at how many times that term comes up in these kinds of reports. There is no terrorism in this context. There is no reason for Israel to be using military force, and every claim that Palestinians have of casualties must be the result of Israel deliberately trying to kill Palestinians. And that image that Manfred talked about, the blood libel, gets reinforced over and over and over again, to the point where it becomes accepted wisdom in the United Nations, in diplomatic corridors, in the journalists, and by others. Often we see this mixed with classical theological and anti-Semitic themes. At Christmas time, around the issue of Bethlehem, it is the Israeli occupying forces who are indiscriminately harassing and mistreating the Palestinians. This is an image, this is a Christmas card that you can still buy from War on Want. It was on their website. This is the images that are, this is a charity, a large and important recognized charity in Britain. This is the Christian Aid version, not a Christmas card, but a poster in a major campaign of the suffering of the children of Bethlehem. And the narrative that goes with it is the Jews, the Israelis, are without any reason attacking and killing and wounding innocent Palestinians, and they become the substitute for the Jesus image. And these things get put together. This is an Oxfam poster with a blood orange, also calling for a boycott of Israel. War on Want, they take pop stars and bring them to photographic opportunities to be able to write graffiti on the wall where the language gets repeated, and that also has an impact. It gets on the website, and the younger generation very much gets pulled into this cycle of seeing Israel strictly in terms of delegitimization. NGO Monitor, what we are trying to do, and I do want to end on a positive note in saying that by naming and shaming exactly the same methods that the human rights organizations claim to employ, we are beginning to have an impact and forcing the organization, and more importantly, I think the funders, to take a look at what they're doing. We are engaging in dialogues. I think a great deal of the responsibility, and I say this to any European diplomats who are in the room, the responsibility for these activities also goes to those who provide them with the huge amounts of money. There are at least $150 million, it's not as many euros anymore, going into these organizations from government sources, largely from Europe, per year. Now, I don't know the exact amount because a large part of it is hidden. In our activities, we have a new report coming out on the EU funding of Israeli, Palestinian, and European NGOs involved in these kinds of radical political activities. You cannot find from the European Union an amount of how much they're giving. A large proportion of what they're doing is hidden, despite the European claim to promote transparency. The Europeans are good at preaching transparency, I mean the European Union in particular, to others. But when you try to find out what some of their NGO funding activities do and who they give it to, who they give money to, they get a lot of excuses. Some parts are now becoming more transparent, and they should clearly be much more transparent because there needs to be oversight in this area. There are many different offices, and when you look at who they're giving money to, many of these organizations are among the most active in using terms like apartheid, war crimes, collective punishment, and making false accusations against Israel. Across the board. And there has to be some sort of accountability here. And our report is hopefully the beginning of that process, a very detailed report, what's available, what's not available, and where the money goes, so that this can start taking place. We know it's already been raised in the European Parliament, and it needs to be taken further. I won't go into the details here again, and we have copies of the draft report if anybody wants it afterwards. But what we see is that at each level, at each stage, I get two more, good. I thought I was running out. At each stage of the process, European officials claim to be promoting peace, to promoting dialogue, but when you look at the people that they give the money to, and the organizations, Jeff Halper at the Israel Committee Against Housing Demolitions, that use the term apartheid in every appearance that they have, standing next to Naim Atik from Sabil, which is one of the most vicious anti-Semitic organizations, and providing that legitimacy. This is provided for by Europe. I'll take a quick lead into Trevor Asherson's comments in saying that the BBC goes very often to these officials for comments. So Halper is better known to a BBC audience than he is to Israel. He's funded by the EU. The same thing is true for Adala. The same thing is true for dozens of organizations that are involved in this political process, this delegitimization. And there's no accountability. There's no address to go to the European Union and say, how is this process taking place? It is all very carefully hidden through the bureaucracy. As I said, this is beginning to become understood. We have more and more awareness among some journalists. It needs to go much further, that they need to check claims by NGOs just as they check the claims made by government spokespeople. If an Israeli government official or an American government official makes a statement, whether it's about Iraq or Afghanistan, there are claims of innocent civilians being killed, a good journalist will not simply take the word of a government spokesperson and saying this was a military target, there were no civilian casualties. They will go and investigate. But on NGOs, the halo effect still applies. You need to look at least as much at the NGO claims as you do with the government claims. And the journalists are beginning to do it. Serious journalists who are going beyond the facade and not simply repeating word for word the handouts of the organizations. The challenge that we have is to make sure that the damage that was done through the Durban strategy that underlies all of this, where the NGOs play such a critical role in 2001, is not just that it's not repeated in the Durban Review Conference of 2009. And there I think the Canadian government and Canadian officials get a great deal of credit for having pulled out and said, we will not participate and we will not support any NGO. We will not repeat our mistakes of 2001. By allowing our funding to be used for travesty again in 2009. The question is, will other funders, particularly in Europe, will other NGOs that claim to promote universal human rights, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and B'Tselem and other organizations, stand up and be counted and say, we will not participate again in a travesty like this in 2009? Thank you.